Most of the deep web is ordinary and private, but in 2016, one hidden marketplace offered a menu that included intimidation, assault, and murder. To understand how that site could exist, we need to separate three things that are often treated as if they mean the same thing. First, there is the surface web. That is the internet most of us use every day. News sites, social media, online stores, YouTube. Pages that can be indexed by standard search engines and opened through familiar browsers such as Chrome or Safari. But the surface web is only a small fraction of what exists online. Below it is the deep web, material that search engines do not index. Despite the ominous name, most of it is completely routine. Your email inbox is part of the deep web. So are private cloud files, medical records, academic databases, subscription services, and the page showing your bank balance. If access requires a password, an account, or specific authorization, it probably sits somewhere inside the deep web. Then there is the dark web. Unlike ordinary private content, the dark web is intentionally hidden. Its sites often use addresses ending in onion, and they cannot be reached through a normal search in a standard browser. Access usually requires software such as Tor. Tor routes a user's traffic through multiple relays, wrapping the connection in layers of encryption. Think of it as sending a message through several locked rooms. Each room knows where the message came from immediately before it arrived and where it needs to go next, but no single room is supposed to see the complete journey. That design can make identifying a user difficult. Difficult does not mean impossible. People still reuse usernames. They download files. They leave records on their devices. They move cryptocurrency through identifiable services. They log in at the wrong time or copy one piece of information from a private account into an anonymous conversation. Tor can conceal a route, but it cannot prevent the person using it from leaving evidence somewhere else. And the technology itself is not inherently criminal. Journalists may use it to communicate with confidential sources. Activists and whistleblowers may depend on it in places where speaking openly is dangerous. Government agencies can use similar privacy tools for legitimate work. Anonymity is a tool. What matters is what someone does with it. And hidden among those legitimate uses were marketplaces built around drugs, stolen information, false identification, weapons, and services that claim to offer something even darker: violence on demand. One of those sites called itself Basa Mafia. The name appeared to invoke Albanian organized crime. Its promotional material was designed to feel menacing and authentic, and its customers were presented with choices: intimidation, assault, arson, murder. The site claimed that a buyer could select a service, provide information about a target, and pay in Bitcoin. In theory, there would be no awkward meeting in a parking lot, no envelope of cash, no direct conversation with a killer. A customer could sit behind a screen, transfer cryptocurrency, and convince themselves that the distance made them invisible. In 2016, leaked material from Basa Mafia began drawing attention to one order in particular. The intended target was not a public figure or someone living inside a criminal world. She was a 43-year-old mother and dog trainer in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. Her name was Amy Allwine, and the customer trying to have her killed used the name Dog Day God. The first public accounts of the case sounded almost unbelievable. Federal agents had learned that someone, somewhere, was shopping for Amy's death.
I had told the couple and Cottage Grove detectives it had received information that a murder-for-hire inquiry had been located on the dark web, with Amy Allwine as the intended target. The dark web is that untraceable part of the internet where anything goes, including a site like Basa Mafia, which provides contract killings and claims to be part of an Albanian organized crime family. To establish themselves as legit, Basa Mafia posted ominous videos of their hitmen torching cars. Then last May, Basa Mafia was hacked. Their client emails posted for all to see, including the FBI. Agents spotting an email from a customer named Dog Day God, who wanted Amy Allwine of Minnesota. The Mafia was an elaborate hoax.
We have zero information at this point that any of the hits that were ordered on that website were actually carried out. In fact, there's pretty good evidence, I think, that it was just a scam to scam people out of Bitcoin.
So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, adieu.
Go to the dark website today and you get a song from The Sound of Music and this message: Basa Mafia has closed for business. No one was ever beaten up.
Amy and Steven Allwine did not look like a family living under a death threat. To the people around them, They looked like the couple others approached when their own marriages were in trouble. In 2016, Amy and Steven were both 43. They had met at a Christian college, married, and spent roughly 20 years building a life together. They adopted a son, and by 2016, the three of them were living in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. Their son was 9 years old. From the outside, the shape of their life seemed easy to understand. Faith, family, work, church. A long marriage that appeared stable enough for other people to use it as a model. But before we go any further, Amy needs to be seen as more than the woman at the center of a murder case. She was a mother, a business owner, and a dog trainer. She had spent years growing active dog sports training, working with owners and their dogs while developing a reputation as someone who could push people without making them feel small. Her students remembered her as motivating and relentlessly positive. She seemed to have something encouraging to say even when a session was difficult or progress was slow. Her best friend, Jane, would later describe something similar. When Amy looked at you, Jane said, "You saw goodness and kindness." She smiled with her eyes. She cared deeply about the people and animals in her life, and she did not appear to want much beyond the world she had already created. That world kept her busy. Running a training business meant more than showing up for lessons. There were clients, schedules, travel plans, and competitions. Amy sometimes traveled out of state for dog events, including trips connected to competitions in Illinois and Atlanta. At the time, those details were ordinary pieces of her work. Later, they would surface somewhere much darker. Someone would provide a murder-for-hire website with information about Amy's planned travel, even suggesting that she might be easier to kill while she was away from home. That matters. But in 2016, no one around Amy had a reason to treat her competition schedule as dangerous information. Steven's work was built around a different kind of knowledge. He was an information technology specialist who worked from home, using a basement office filled with computer equipment. He understood networks, devices, online accounts, and the systems most people use without thinking much about what happens behind the screen. He also held a position of trust that had nothing to do with technology. Steven was an elder in the United Church of God. He preached, advised members of the congregation, and helped couples who were struggling in their relationships. Amy served as a deaconess. Together, they were visibly involved in church life, presenting themselves not merely as attendees, but as people willing to guide others. They even made instructional dance videos together. The purpose was practical, to teach members how to dance while remaining within the values and expectations of their church. It is such a specific detail, and that is exactly why it stands out. Amy and Steven were not simply saying that faith shaped their marriage. They were publicly demonstrating it, side by side. People saw a husband and wife who had lasted for 2 decades. They saw parents raising a child. They saw 2 respected church members who appeared committed to the same beliefs. If another couple was having problems, Amy and Steven seemed like safe people to approach. That was the public picture. And we need to be careful here. Appearances are not evidence that a marriage is healthy. Friends see conversations. Students see lessons. Congregants see services, church events, and carefully chosen moments. They do not necessarily see what happens after everyone goes home. Still, the people around the Allwines did not describe an obvious war inside the marriage. They remembered Amy as upbeat. They believed the couple appeared to get along. There was no visible rival circling her business, no public feud, and no clear enemy who seemed willing to pay thousands of dollars to make her disappear. One of Amy's students later spoke about the woman she had known and the couple everyone else thought they understood.
Sweet lady. Whenever you talk to her, she's always upbeat. Everybody's pretty much shocked about it. They've always seemed like they got along very well, and we've never heard issues or anything like that. Pretty shocking.
The FBI could tell Amy that she was a murder target. It could not tell her who wanted her dead. In May 2016, 2 federal agents arrived at the Allwine home in Cottage Grove. They had the kind of information no family expects to hear at the front door. Someone had paid thousands of dollars in Bitcoin to have Amy murdered. The order had appeared on Basa Mafia, a hidden website that claimed customers could purchase assaults, intimidation, and contract killings. By then, information from the site had been exposed. Basa Mafia appeared to be a scam. It took customers' cryptocurrency, promised violence, and then offered excuses when nothing happened. The people behind it understood that anyone trying to arrange a murder was unlikely to report being cheated. That meant the supposed hitmen probably did not exist. The customer did. That customer used the name Dog Day God. The record showed a person who had repeatedly contacted Basa Mafia about Amy. More than $12,000 in Bitcoin had reportedly changed hands as the customer pushed for action. Different plans were discussed. Amy could be killed in a staged car accident. Her home could be set on fire while she was trapped inside. Each plan failed, and Dog Day God became increasingly frustrated. There was also an alleged motive. When the site asked about the customer's connection to Amy, Dog Day God claimed that Amy had slept with the customer's husband. Another message accused her of stealing clients from the customer's business. The language was vicious. The customer said they needed that bitch dead, but none of it made sense to Amy. She said she had not had an affair. She had not stolen anyone's clients. Her dog training business had taken years of work to build, and she could not identify a competitor who might believe she had taken something from them. Nor could she think of a woman whose husband she had supposedly been involved with. Think about the position that left her in. The threat was specific enough to include her identity and movements, yet the stated reasons belonged to a life she did not recognize. Amy could not explain the accusations because, from her perspective, they were false. She began to wonder whether someone had confused her with another person. The FBI's warning prevented her from dismissing it. A stranger had spent real money and had provided enough information to identify her. Even if Basa Mafia was fraudulent, the desire behind the order was not imaginary. Amy changed how she lived. She limited the amount of time she spent outside. Cameras were installed around the property. The family added stronger locks to the doors and windows. Steven bought a handgun for Amy to use for protection. That detail matters. To Amy, her husband appeared to be helping her survive an outside threat. He was standing beside her while agents described the plot. He helped reinforce the house. He gave her a weapon because someone, somewhere, wanted her dead. But locks only work when you know which side of the door the danger is on. As the weeks passed, the uncertainty wore Amy down. Her anxiety grew. She developed severe migraines and often felt exhausted and physically unwell. There were periods when she stayed in bed because she felt too drained to do much else. Then, in July, the threat found a new way into the house. Emails began arriving from an unknown sender who called herself Jane. This person repeated the same basic story Amy had already heard from the FBI. Amy had supposedly been involved with another woman's husband, and she was responsible for that woman's life falling apart. Jane demanded that Amy die by suicide. One message told her, "Commit suicide. By the time I am done with you, you will want it to end anyway. So why not do it now?" The sender warned that if Amy refused, things and people would slowly be taken from her. Her family would suffer, and Amy would be left knowing she could have prevented it. This was not a single angry message sent in the heat of the moment. Jane seemed determined to make Amy feel watched. The emails referred to places where Amy's vehicle had been parked. They described clothing her 9-year-old son had worn. They listed relatives, where those relatives lived, information about Amy's business, and details from her daily life. The message was simple. There was nowhere private left. Jane even acknowledged the precautions Amy had taken, mentioning the new security system. That meant the cameras and locks did not provide the reassurance they were supposed to provide. Every attempt to make the family safer became another sign that the sender was still paying attention. Amy brought the emails back to investigators. The similarities to the dark web order were hard to ignore. Both involved the same alleged affair. Both mentioned a grievance connected to Amy's business. Both used degrading language. And both focused on the same outcome. Amy had to die. Still, similarity was not attribution. Investigators could suspect that Jane and Dog Day God were the same person without being able to prove who sat behind either name. The sender had used methods designed to conceal identifying information. The visible address offered no meaningful route back to a person, and anonymous email and privacy tools made conventional tracing difficult. The problem was no longer whether someone was threatening Amy. The threats were right there on the screen. The problem was attaching them to a human being. At the time, Amy did not know that the messages were being created with knowledge from inside her own world. She saw an unknown woman with the wrong story, someone who had somehow mistaken Amy for the person who ruined her marriage and damaged her business. Later, prosecutors would argue that the emails served two purposes. The first was direct: frighten Amy, isolate her, exhaust her, and push her toward taking her own life. The second was colder. If Amy later appeared to die by suicide, the emails could help explain why. Months of migraines, fear, time spent in bed, and messages ordering her to kill herself would create a ready-made story. The hired killer appeared to be fictional, but the campaign against Amy had moved beyond a fraudulent website. Someone with close knowledge of her family was now trying to isolate, frighten, and psychologically exhaust her. On November 13th, the warnings seemed to fulfill themselves, but the scene inside the Allwine home contained details the staged story could not explain. Amy began the morning steaming pumpkins for pies. By evening, the oven was still on, food scented the house, and a police officer who knew her was crying inside the bedroom. It was Sunday, November 13th, 2016, 10 days before Thanksgiving. Snow covered the roads around Cottage Grove, Minnesota, and the Allwine's rural property sat well back from them, surrounded by 26 acres of land. Inside, the day began with ordinary plans. Amy was preparing the pumpkins. Steven was downstairs, working from his basement office. Around noon, Amy, Steven, and their 9-year-old son sat down together for lunch. Then Amy said she felt dizzy and lightheaded. On its own, that may not have seemed unusual. The threats had worn her down for months. She had been anxious, exhausted, and suffering from severe migraines. She had spent long stretches in bed because she felt physically ill. So when Amy went to lie down after lunch, the explanation appeared to fit what everyone already knew. She had been under unbearable stress. Now she was sick again. At about 1 o'clock that afternoon, Amy's father arrived at the house. Steven told him that Amy was in bed. There was no immediate suggestion that something catastrophic had happened. Amy was unwell, but she had been unwell before. Her father stayed for approximately an hour and then left. Only minutes later, Steven called him and asked him to come back. He said he wanted to take Amy to see a doctor, and he needed someone to pick up their son. Amy's father agreed, returned to the property, and took the boy with him. That left Amy and Steven alone in the house. Hours passed. At around 5 o'clock, Steven called Amy's father again. He said he was running late because he needed to stop at a gas station. About half an hour later, Steven arrived to collect his son. Naturally, Amy's father asked about his daughter. Steven said Amy had changed her mind. She had decided not to go to the doctor after all. Think about how unremarkable that might have sounded in the moment. Someone feels dizzy. Her husband plans to take her for medical care. Then she decides she would rather stay home and rest. Nothing about that explanation necessarily demands panic. Steven and his son left and went to Culver's for dinner. They returned to the house shortly before 7 that evening. The boy went into his parents' bedroom. There, he found his mother unresponsive on the floor. Steven called 911 and immediately offered an explanation. He thought his wife had shot herself. He described blood and said a handgun appeared to be near her. But as the dispatcher tried to establish whether Amy might still be alive, something about the exchange felt strangely detached. Steven was not beside her. He remained with his son. When asked whether Amy was breathing, he said he did not know. The dispatcher had to ask whether he was willing to check her or whether he believed she was already beyond help. Only then did Steven return to the room. He reported that Amy was not breathing. He could not tell the dispatcher where she had been shot. During the call, he did not directly ask for an ambulance or plead for anyone to save her. He seemed to be reporting what he saw rather than urgently seeking help. That does not prove murder. People react to shock in different ways, and there is no single correct way to sound when a person discovers a spouse dead. But the call established something important from the beginning. Before officers had examined the room, before anyone had tested Amy's hands or studied the gun, Steven had already framed her death as a suicide. Cottage Grove police rushed to the property. One of the first officers to respond was Gwen Martin. The address meant something to her. Amy had attended an 8-week citizen law enforcement academy where Martin taught members of the community about police work. Martin knew who lived there. The house was set far back from the road. It was already dark, with snow across the surrounding roads and grounds. Then Martin entered the bedroom and saw Amy. Despite 18 years in law enforcement, she began to cry. Her mind raced. The Amy she remembered did not fit what she was seeing. Martin could not accept that Amy would have taken her own life. Of course, an officer's personal certainty is not forensic evidence. Knowing someone does not make suicide impossible, and first impressions cannot decide how a person died. But Martin's reaction mattered because it marked the first human challenge to Steven's account. Then the room began presenting challenges of its own. The house still carried the smell of food. The oven remained on. The pumpkins Amy had started preparing that morning were still cooking, as if the family Sunday had been interrupted without warning and never resumed. Amy was lying on her back. Her hands were down by her sides. A 9mm handgun rested near her left elbow. A cartridge casing was found near her right leg. The gunshot wound, however, was on the right side of her head. Amy was right-handed. For Steven's explanation to work, she would have needed to position the weapon awkwardly against the right side of her head, then fire at a downward trajectory before the gun came to rest on the opposite side of her body. Could a weapon move after being fired? Yes. Could an unusual position ever be possible? Also yes. One strange detail is rarely enough to settle a death investigation, but this was not one detail. The location of the handgun did not sit comfortably with the wound. Amy's dominant hand did not fit the apparent firing position. The bullet's downward path made the movement even more difficult to explain, and Amy's hands were clean. There was no blood on them. There was no gunshot residue either. The microscopic material that can settle on a person's skin after a firearm is discharged nearby. Its absence does not automatically prove that someone never fired a gun. But combined with everything else in that room, it further weakened the story Steven had given the dispatcher. What he presented as a suicide did not match the weapon placement, Amy's dominant hand, the bullet path, or the condition of her hands. The room offered a simple explanation, but the physical evidence resisted it. And the most important clue was not beside Amy's body. It was already moving through her bloodstream. Amy had no prescription for scopolamine. Toxicology found the drug in her blood at more than 45 times the therapeutic level. Scopolamine is a real medication with legitimate uses. In controlled doses, it can prevent nausea and motion sickness. It is also sometimes given around surgery, but at excessive levels, its effects become far more serious. A person can become severely disoriented. Their memory can fail. They may lose consciousness and become physically helpless. The concentration in Amy's blood was nowhere near an ordinary therapeutic amount. That changed the way investigators had to look at the bedroom. This was no longer only a questionable shooting with a gun placed on the wrong side of Amy's body. It was now a possible drugging followed by a staged homicide. And toxicology was only one problem. The medical examiner estimated that Amy had died at approximately 3:15 that afternoon, possibly earlier. At that point, her son was safely away from the house with his grandfather. Steven, meanwhile, remained at the property or had access to it. That estimate also collided with something Steven had told investigators. He claimed that at around 5 o'clock, he had spoken with Amy while she was praying in the bedroom. Think about the gap there. According to Steven, Amy was alive and speaking at 5. According to the medical evidence, she had likely been dead for close to 2 hours. One of those versions could not be true. 2 days after Amy's death, Steven sat down with police for an interview that lasted about 2 hours. He appeared quiet and tearful. He kept his head lowered for much of the conversation and said he had no idea why Amy would have killed herself. He had not seen it coming, he said. He felt as though it was somehow his fault. When investigators asked about the threats Amy had received, Steven said he did not know who had sent them. He also said he did not believe the accusations inside those messages. Amy had not been having an affair, as far as he knew. The story about her stealing another woman's husband made no sense to him. Then Steven volunteered a secret of his own. Roughly 2 years earlier, he said, he had been involved in an affair with a woman named Michelle. Amy had never known about it, and Steven said he had never disclosed it to anyone. He claimed he was revealing it now because he wanted to be honest and because he understood how it might look if police discovered it later. On its own, an affair does not prove murder. Investigators knew that. But Steven's disclosure introduced a private version of the marriage that did not match the public one. The respected church elder who counseled other couples had concealed a relationship from his wife. And once detectives began pressing him on the hours surrounding Amy's death, his account became difficult to hold in place. Steven could not provide a stable description of his movements. The number of times he had entered or left the house seemed to change. Details shifted. Even basic questions about where he had been during certain parts of the afternoon produced answers that did not fit neatly together. The house was giving detectives a clearer account. The Allwines kept dogs, and investigators noticed dog hair across much of the home. That was normal. What was not normal was one section of the hallway that looked unusually clean. Against the surrounding floors, it stood out as though someone had recently given that specific area far more attention than anywhere else. So investigators sprayed luminol. Luminol is a chemical used to reveal possible traces of blood that have been wiped away or washed from a visible surface. It does not solve a crime by itself, and its reactions still have to be interpreted carefully. But it can show investigators where to look after an attempted cleanup. Here, the reaction suggested something extensive. Investigators found indications of pooled blood and bloody footwear impressions in the hallway. Traces continued into the bathroom and even into the child's room. Whatever had happened inside that house had not been confined to the place where Amy's body was found. The bedroom appeared to tell one story. The rest of the home remembered another. The footwear impressions were consistent with approximately a men's size 12. Steven wore a size 12. Testing also found gunshot residue on Steven's hands, while none was detected on Amy's. Gunshot residue must be considered alongside the circumstances. Its presence can sometimes have innocent explanations, and its absence does not automatically prove that someone never handled or fired a weapon. But here, it did not stand alone. Amy had no residue on her hands. Steven did. The gun had been placed near Amy's left elbow, even though she was right-handed. The wound was on the right side of her head, at a downward angle that would have required an extremely awkward movement if she had fired the shot herself. Her blood contained an enormous concentration of a drug she had never been prescribed, and blood had apparently been cleaned from areas outside the bedroom. Piece by piece, the suicide scene was coming apart. The medical examiner did not formally classify Amy's death as suicide. The manner of death was initially left undetermined. That distinction mattered. It meant the available evidence did not support closing the case under the explanation Steven had offered almost immediately. Investigators listened to his 911 call again with the forensic findings in mind. What had first sounded like shock now seemed more troubling. Steven calmly described the blood and said he thought his wife had shot herself. He made that assumption before establishing where the wound was. He did not directly plead for an ambulance or ask the dispatcher how to save her. When asked whether Amy was breathing, he initially said he did not know because he was with his son. None of that proved guilt by itself. People react unpredictably to trauma. Some scream. Some become unnaturally calm. Some struggle to follow even simple instructions. But this call was no longer being heard by itself. It sat beside the scopolamine, the conflicting time of death, the cleaned hallway, the bloody impressions, the residue, the changing account of Steven's movements. Taken together, those details pushed investigators away from uncertainty and toward homicide. The prosecution would eventually present a reconstruction supported by that cumulative evidence. Amy had been drugged until she was disoriented or unconscious. She was shot in the hallway, where the larger traces of blood were found. Her body was then moved into the bedroom. The gun was positioned nearby to create the appearance of suicide. While the child remained away with his grandfather, blood was cleaned from the hallway, bathroom, and other parts of the home. Then Steven collected his son, returned to the house, and allowed the staged bedroom to be discovered. The house had supplied what the bedroom concealed: blood outside the room, evidence of an attempted cleanup, a drug Amy had not been prescribed, and a timeline placing Steven with access to her near the likely time of death. Detectives now had strong reasons to suspect him. What they did not yet have was the full motive, or proof that Amy's death had been planned long before that snowy Sunday. Those answers were not on the floor. They were downstairs. In the basement office, detectives found enough computer equipment to turn one suspicious death into an investigation spanning aliases, anonymous email, cryptocurrency, and more than 60 digital devices. Steven knew how to hide online. His mistake was assuming that anonymous meant invisible. Investigators found a substantial collection of computer equipment in his basement office. This was not the setup of someone fumbling through the dark web for the first time. Steven worked in information technology. He understood computers, online security, and the tools people use to conceal where they have been. That made the examination harder. It also made every small mistake more important. Cottage Grove police could not untangle this alone. The investigation drew in the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, federal investigators, and digital forensic specialists. Computers, phones, online accounts, cryptocurrency records, deleted notes, browser activity. Each piece had to be recovered, dated, compared, and placed into a larger sequence. Fred Fink, who managed the criminal division of the Washington County Attorney's Office, described it as the most complicated case he had ever seen. Usually, he said, prosecutors rely heavily on human witnesses. Here, electronic and scientific evidence would have to do much of the talking. And the devices began by exposing the life Steven had kept separate from his church. During his police interview, he admitted to one affair with a woman named Michelle, saying it had happened about 2 years earlier. He presented the disclosure almost like a precaution, something investigators should hear from him before discovering it elsewhere. But the digital examination indicated at least 3 affairs. Investigators connected them to Ashley Madison, a platform marketed to people seeking relationships outside their marriages. Here is the contradiction that is hard to ignore. Steven reportedly learned about Ashley Madison while counseling married couples through the church. He was supposed to be helping other people protect their relationships. Instead, investigators said he used that knowledge to conduct a second life of his own. Prosecutors would later present those affairs as part of a possible motive, though not the whole answer. Divorce could have carried serious personal and religious consequences for a church elder whose public identity rested on marriage and faith. There was also Amy's life insurance policy, reportedly worth around $700,000, with Steven named as the beneficiary. Neither fact, by itself, proved murder. Plenty of people have affairs. Plenty of spouses hold life insurance policies. The importance came from what investigators found beside them. On Basa Mafia, the customer calling himself Dog Day God had access to Amy's private schedule. He told the site that she would be traveling to Illinois for a dog training competition. If she could not be killed there, he offered another opportunity. She was expected to be in Atlanta a few weeks later. The account discussed prices and different kinds of attacks. Making a death resemble an accident cost one amount. A direct killing cost another. Dog Day God asked for the price of a hit near Chicago, ideally staged as an accident. Later, after those plans failed, the discussion shifted to Amy's own home. The supposed killer would murder her there and then set the property on fire. But it was one photograph that began tightening the connection. On March 6th, Dog Day God sent Basa Mafia a picture of Amy taken during a trip to Hawaii. Investigators found that Steven had downloaded that same photograph from the family computer only seconds earlier. Think about how narrow that window is. The same image moved from the Allwine computer to the murder-for-hire account almost immediately. It was not absolute proof on its own, but it was no longer easy to explain as coincidence. Then came the Bitcoin. Cryptocurrency can obscure the real names behind payments, but it does not erase the payments themselves. Bitcoin transactions are recorded on a public ledger called the blockchain. Picture a digital notebook shared across a network. Instead of listing Steven paid Basa Mafia, it records transfers between long strings of letters and numbers known as wallet addresses. A wallet address does not automatically tell you who owns it. Once investigators connect a specific address to a person or device, however, the blockchain allows them to follow the money. The entry remains there. It cannot simply be deleted because someone clears a browser or removes a note. On March 22nd, Steven copied a Bitcoin wallet address into the Notes app on his iPhone. Less than 30 seconds later, Dog Day God sent that exact address to Basa Mafia. Then the note disappeared from the phone. That sequence became one of the prosecution's strongest digital links. A unique wallet address appeared on Steven's device, was transmitted almost immediately by Dog Day God, and was then deleted. The timing left investigators with a direct question. If Steven was not controlling that account, how did Dog Day God obtain the same address within seconds? Steven had also reported that he lost nearly $6,000 while trying to purchase Bitcoin through a scam. Investigators viewed that report differently once they reconstructed the Basa Mafia payments. To them, it looked like an attempt to create an innocent explanation for why so much money had vanished into cryptocurrency. Across multiple weeks, almost $13,000 in Bitcoin was sent as Dog Day God pushed for Amy's death. The messages showed growing frustration. Basa Mafia kept taking money without producing a body. At one point, the site claimed its supposed killer had been stopped and arrested by police. The murder-for-hire service was a scam, but the customer's intent, prosecutors argued, was not. And when that route failed, the digital trail moved somewhere else. Evidence showed activity on Dream Market connected to an effort to obtain scopolamine. The same drug later found in Amy's blood at more than 45 times the therapeutic concentration. The online search for that substance mattered because it connected the failed remote plan to what happened inside the house. Someone had first tried to outsource the killing. Then, investigators believed that person looked for a way to incapacitate Amy. The threatening emails left their own trail. Steven's MacBook had been used with Tor, the software that can conceal internet activity by routing it through multiple relays. Investigators also found a note referring to shark lasers, a service associated with disposable email accounts. Then they compared Steven's searches with the first detailed message from Jane. The day before Jane sent Amy an email naming relatives and describing where they lived, Steven searched for those same people and addresses. Jane seemed to possess intimate knowledge of Amy's family, business, child, clothing, movements, and security system. But that knowledge did not have to come from a stranger watching through the trees. Much of it was available to someone already inside Amy's life. No single artifact carried the entire case. The attribution came from accumulation. The Hawaii photograph downloaded seconds before Dog Day God uploaded it. The unique Bitcoin address copied on Steven's phone and sent moments later. The cryptocurrency transfers, Amy's travel schedule, the anonymous email tools, the searches that anticipated Jane's messages, and the activity involving the same drug found in Amy's body. That was the prosecution's answer to the question haunting this case. Dog Day God and Jane were not two outside enemies closing in on Amy. They were parts of an identity Steven had constructed around her, one that ordered her death, watched her movements, and then told her to blame herself. The digital trail connected Steven to the murder-for-hire account, the anonymous threats, the Bitcoin payments, and the search for the drug found in Amy's body. The supposed stranger watching Amy from outside the home had been built from information available inside it. Yet proving a hidden online identity was not identical to proving first-degree murder. In court, prosecutors still had to turn thousands of technical fragments into one deliberate sequence a jury could trust. The defense did not need to make Steven's behavior look innocent. It needed to make the investigation look uncertain. Steven Allwine was arrested in January 2017, roughly 2 months after Amy's death. By then, the case had attracted attention for a deeply unusual reason. Law enforcement had known about a plot against Amy before she was killed. The FBI had warned the Allwines 6 months earlier that someone had tried to hire a killer through the dark web. Now Amy was dead, and authorities were accusing the husband who had supposedly helped protect her. Steven was initially charged with second-degree murder. He was released on bail while investigators, prosecutors, and federal authorities continued working through an enormous volume of evidence. Much of it was not the kind of evidence that could be placed in a plastic bag and carried into court. It existed across phones, computers, online accounts, Bitcoin transactions, browsing histories, and forensic timestamps. In February, Steven returned to court after attempting to contact his son despite being specifically ordered not to do so. Then, in March, a grand jury indicted him on the more serious charge, premeditated first-degree murder. For members of the United Church of God, the accusation was almost impossible to reconcile with the man they thought they knew. Steven had been a respected elder. He had preached, advised couples, and presented himself as someone committed to marriage and faith. The church released a statement expressing profound sadness and shock. But that public identity was not evidence of murder. The prosecution could not simply point to hypocrisy and ask a jury to convict. Being an unfaithful husband did not make Steven a killer. Being a church elder did not make him incapable of becoming one. The case had to stand on what could be proved, and the prosecution's argument was built in layers. First came the attempts to outsource Amy's murder. Dog Day God had paid thousands of dollars in Bitcoin to a fraudulent dark web service, provided Amy's photograph, described her travel plans, and discussed ways to make her death appear accidental. When those efforts failed, the campaign changed. Amy began receiving messages from Jane, an invented enemy who seemed to know where she parked, what her son wore, and where members of her family lived. Then came the evidence involving scopolamine. Investigators found that Steven had searched another dark web marketplace for the drug. Amy's toxicology results later showed an extraordinarily high concentration of that same substance in her blood. Inside the house, the physical evidence challenged the staged suicide. Amy's hands did not carry the residue expected from firing the weapon. Steven's did. The wound, the gun's placement, and Amy's dominant hand did not fit comfortably with the scene as it had been presented. Then there was the cleaned hallway. Luminol revealed blood and bloody footprints in areas that appeared spotless to the naked eye. The prints were consistent with a size 12 shoe. Steven wore a size 12. The medical examiner's estimate of Amy's time of death also contradicted Steven's claim that he had spoken with her later that afternoon. The prosecution added motive to that structure. Investigators had uncovered multiple affairs, not merely the single relationship Steven initially admitted. Amy also had a life insurance policy worth approximately $700,000, with Steven as the beneficiary. Still, none of those facts carried the case alone. An affair is not a murder. A life insurance policy is common. Gunshot residue can become the subject of competing explanations. A footprint size identifies a category of people, not one person. Even suspicious searches require attribution. Who used the device? When? Could information have synchronized from somewhere else? That was the practical challenge facing prosecutors. They had to explain blockchain records, copied wallet addresses, deleted notes, browser activity, anonymous email services, and device synchronization without turning the courtroom into a 90-minute lecture on computer science. The jury needed to understand one central point. Digital evidence does not become meaningless simply because it is complicated. Steven had copied a Bitcoin wallet address into the Notes app on his iPhone. Less than 30 seconds later, Dog Day God sent that exact address to Basa Mafia. The note was then deleted. Searches for Amy's relatives and their addresses appeared shortly before Jane sent Amy those same details. Records tied Steven's devices to Tar, anonymous email tools, the murder-for-hire communications, and efforts to obtain scopolamine. The defense pushed back against the architecture of the case. Steven's attorneys argued that there was little direct physical evidence proving he had killed Amy. They raised concerns about contamination at the crime scene and warned jurors against treating his affairs as proof of homicide. They also challenged the prosecution's presentation itself. It sounded dramatic because it was dramatic. A church elder, secret affairs, cryptocurrency, anonymous threats, a dark web hitman, poison, and a staged suicide. But real trials are not television. A compelling story, the defense insisted, could not replace proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That was a fair warning. Narratives can make disconnected facts appear inevitable. The jury's job was to decide whether these facts were truly connected, or whether investigators had taken a suspicious husband and forced every uncertainty to point toward him. But the strength of the prosecution's case was convergence. The medical evidence did not stand alone. Neither did the blood cleanup, the false timeline, the gunshot residue, the affairs, the insurance policy, or the online records. Physical, medical, financial, and electronic findings had been developed by different investigators through different methods. Again and again, they arrived at the same person. And hanging over all of it was the psychological contrast. Steven had counseled couples while pursuing affairs. He had stood beside Amy as she lived under threat. He had helped install security and purchased a gun for her protection. Prosecutors said he was not protecting her from an unknown enemy. He had created that enemy. In January 2018, the jury found Steven Allwine guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The verdict rejected the idea that Amy's death had been an unexplained suicide or a sudden, impulsive act. Jurors accepted that it was the final stage of a plan begun online months earlier. Steven was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, the judge called him cold and hypocritical. He described Steven as an extraordinary actor who could turn his tears on and off. But the cruelest performance had not taken place in court. For months, Amy believed an unknown woman was watching her. She changed how she lived, added locks, limited her time outside, and became physically ill from fear. The person beside her, the husband helping her secure the house, was the person prosecutors proved had built the danger around her. The verdict settled Steven's guilt in court. Years later, from a prison chapel, he offered a different culprit, and then a controversy involving a prosecution expert gave that denial new legal oxygen. For 5 years, Steven Allwine said nothing publicly about Amy's death. When he finally spoke, he claimed the evidence had not exposed him. It had been planted around him. The interview took place in the chapel at Stillwater Prison, where Steven was serving life without the possibility of parole. He had not testified at trial. He had never publicly explained the dark web messages, the Bitcoin records, or the files recovered from his devices in any extended way. Now, roughly 5 years after Amy's murder, he offered an alternative story. Steven said that when he saw Amy that night, he looked into her eyes and knew there was nothing there. He insisted she had not deserved what happened to her. Then came the direct question. Did he kill Amy? No, Steven said. He claimed that, after reviewing the evidence, he believed someone connected to Amy's work was responsible. He did not produce proof identifying that person. But his larger argument was clear. Someone else had killed Amy, then manipulated Steven's digital world to make him look guilty. That theory had to account for one detail in particular: the Bitcoin wallet address tied to the murder-for-hire payments. Investigators had found that address within Steven's Apple ecosystem. At trial, it became one of the strongest links between Steven and Dog Day God, the account that had spent months trying to arrange Amy's death. Steven disputed the claim that the address had appeared directly on his phone. His explanation was that another person could have placed it in cloud storage. The cloud then synchronized with his MacBook, making the information appear on his device without him putting it there. Think about what that would require. Someone would need access to Steven's systems. That person would need to understand which data to place there, where to place it, and how to make it synchronize across his devices. And they would need to do it in a way that matched the timing and content of the dark web activity already attributed to Dog Day God. The interviewer put the problem plainly. Steven appeared to be describing an elaborate compromise designed specifically to frame him, yet no supporting evidence of that operation had been produced. Steven answered, in effect, yes and no. He acknowledged that he could not prove his theory. He also admitted that he had failed to follow the same cybersecurity advice he gave other people. Change your passwords. Use different passwords for different accounts. Keep them updated. For an information technology professional, that admission matters. Weak password practices can leave systems vulnerable, but vulnerability is not the same thing as evidence that a particular intrusion occurred. A door being unlocked does not prove that someone walked through it, much less that they planted every item later found inside. Steven's final defense was personal. If you know me as an individual, he said, I couldn't have done it. But the jury had heard from people who thought they knew him. Church members knew an elder who counseled married couples. Amy knew the husband who installed security measures and bought her a gun after the threats began. Behind that public identity, investigators found affairs, anonymous emails, dark web communications, cryptocurrency transfers, and searches that tracked the private information later used to terrorize Amy. The interview lasted nearly 90 minutes. The journalist who conducted it observed that Steven showed little emotion until the final few minutes, almost as if he knew time was running out to persuade the audience. That is one person's impression, not forensic evidence. People display grief, fear, and pressure differently. A flat manner does not prove murder, just as visible tears do not prove innocence. Still, the observation echoed what the sentencing judge had said years earlier when he called Steven an incredible actor who could turn his tears on and off. Steven continued challenging his conviction. His appeal was denied in 2021. Another attempt was denied in 2023. His hacking theory had not displaced the jury's conclusion, and his sentence remained unchanged. Then, in 2025, a different issue emerged. Questions were raised about the educational credentials of Mark Lanterman, a digital forensic expert whose work had been used in thousands of criminal and civil matters. Lanterman had analyzed more than 60 devices connected to the Allwine investigation. Reporting focused on his claim that he had graduated from Uppsala College in New Jersey and his inability to produce a diploma or transcript when challenged. The scrutiny went beyond Lanterman himself. It also raised questions about how Hennepin County had vetted his education, professional history, and credentials before relying on his expertise. The county said proposals were reviewed by a panel and that this was the first complaint it had received regarding his work. Steven saw an opening. He asked how often Lanterman might have made false statements under oath, whether at trial, in a deposition, or in an affidavit. He argued that doubts about an expert's credibility should support a new trial. When confronted with the possibility that people might see this as a get-out-of-jail-free card, Steven told them not to believe him, or Lanterman. He said they should examine the evidence and form their own conclusions. Here's the distinction that matters. Questions about credentials are serious, especially when an expert presents evidence to a jury under the authority of specialized knowledge. But the reporting had not established that Lanterman falsified the substantive forensic findings in Amy's case. No case-specific fabrication had been demonstrated. Legal experts still suggested the controversy could create further litigation. If disputed credentials helped establish an expert's authority, and if that expert's testimony was essential to a conviction, a court may need to examine how much weight the jury placed on it. But Amy's case was not built from one device, one analyst, or one isolated file. Multiple agencies and investigators developed overlapping evidence. There was the physical scene inside the house, the blood cleanup, the footprints, the gunshot residue, the scopolamine in Amy's body, the medical estimate of her time of death. There were searches, anonymous email records, Bitcoin transactions, wallet information, dark web communications, and activity spread across numerous devices. Different trails kept converging on the same person. So if one expert's credibility is damaged, how much of a case built by many investigators should move with it? As of the latest information available, the effect of the credential dispute on any future request for a new trial remained uncertain. Steven remained convicted. He remained sentenced to life without parole. And the suggestion that an unknown person hacked his systems still did not explain the full collection of independent evidence leading back to him. But this story should not end with Steven's passwords or Mark Lanterman's college records. It should end with Amy. Her sister Julie said Amy's final months became a living hell. She lived with threats, surveillance, migraines, fear, and the belief that an unseen stranger was watching her family. She restricted her movements. She secured her home. She became physically ill from the pressure. And still, on her final morning, Amy tried to live an ordinary life. She had work she cared about. She planned to spend time with her son. She steamed pumpkins for food she intended to bake for her family. Her friend Jane remembered Amy as someone whose goodness showed in her eyes. Kind, loving, genuine. There's a cruel coincidence in that name. Jane was also the identity used by the threatening sender who helped make Amy's final months unbearable. We do not know whether Amy was conscious in her final moments. We do not know whether she understood who had betrayed her. We do not know what she believed as the husband who had stood beside her, strengthened the locks, and bought her a gun for protection turned out to be the danger the evidence had been pointing toward. Amy had been warned that an invisible stranger wanted her dead. The darkest part is that the stranger may never have been outside her home. Do you think the questions surrounding Mark Lanherman's credentials should affect Steven Allwine's conviction, or does the rest of the evidence stand independently? Leave your view in the comments. Subscribe for more cases like this, and share this story so Amy remains at the center of it.